Join me today as I interview Camille Block. She's just published a book. It's an extra big dose of hope for those of us who walk alongside someone who seems to have been dealt a really bad hand in life. Welcome, Camille.
Thank you, Cheryl. Nice to be here.
I've been mesmerized by your book. I'm enjoying reading it so much.
Mm.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up writing this book?
Sure. I'll try to summarize. It's quite a story, but pretty much it was my oldest daughter. Ended up we dropped her off at college back in 2013, and we weren't quite ready for her to go. And I was having just we're having kind of a tough time in our family. It was just a rough time. My husband had a horrible commute. We were just our family was very fragmented. So it was kind of an emotional goodbye. And then to my surprise, 2 weeks later, my mom had a massive stroke and ended up not making it after a few days. And I found myself in this crazy unexpected state of grief after just like within 2 or 3 weeks. It was just like I didn't know how to handle it, and I'd never been through anything like that. And so I just found myself very emotional. And I one day, and I'm not a writer. I guess I am now, but I didn't think of myself as a writer. And so I just sat down at the computer, and one day I just felt this urge, like this crazy unction, just to start typing. And I started writing, and what came out of my writing was actually memories of my brother Kevin. And it wasn't anything to do with my daughter or my mom. It was like my brother Kevin. I thought that's so odd. Like, why would that happen? And then before I knew it, the thoughts became paragraphs, and the paragraphs became chapters, and then the chapters turned out like they had titles. And it's like, what is happening? And it's almost like I got overtaken by something greater than myself that just said, you're going to write this. And that's how I began. So that was 11 years ago. So it took me a while.
Yeah, yeah. Writing is a labor of love for sure. Kevin has a part in this story, doesn't he? Tell us about Kevin.
My little brother's Kevin. I have another little brother named Brian, and but Kevin was born 3.5 years after I was, and they figured out within a few months that something wasn't quite right. Ended up he had a very severe cerebral palsy that now he's pretty much lived his life as a quadriplegic. And so Kevin always, always had a connection with Kevin. He was my first little brother, and there was always something special and more needy about him, but so sweet. His eyes just spoke volumes, and my heart just connected with his at a very young age. And I was kind of his caregiver, I guess, in some way. Not caregiver at that age, but just protector. I'd say protector. And then unfortunately, through a lot of different reasons, when my third brother was born, my mom was just kind of overwhelmed, and we didn't have a lot of money. And at the time, it's not like it is today. They didn't really have a lot of support for families with families with disabilities. And so they made the very difficult decision to place my brother in a home outside of ours at age 3.5. And it sounds kind of harsh today, because most families don't do that at that young of an age anymore. But at the time, it was almost what the doctors told families to do. And my parents just kind of they were having a hard time, so they did that. And a lot of the story of my book is based on the lens of my life as a sister of my brother Kevin. And I think even though he didn't live with us, so many dynamics, of course, were taking place. And at this older age in life right now, a lot of this stuff is now just starting to hit me, like things that I never thought about. So Kevin has a very special place in my heart. And at this age, he's still here. And I am his advocate. I'm his co-conservator, both medically and just with his life. And I have a very big role to play in his life. He still lives in the same place, but there's a lot to do. There's a lot of advocacy, health wise, but also other ways, because he's nonverbal. And so I have a big role in his still his protector and his caregiver, and not hands-on every day, but emotionally and physically, I just kind of manage a lot right now. So I don't
Yeah.
know if that answered the question, but
As I was reading this, I was thinking, this story really isn't about Kevin, um, but it is a memoir of a family of origin.
mm,
And
mhm,
and then the other part is just how this experience really formed or dismantled, shaped your image of God.
yeah.
So how did it shape your image of God?
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the reality is the real story is probably the story of God to me, to my life, underneath all this. And that was why this was so emotional coming up. There was and I wasn't done. When I started writing, my story wasn't done. In fact, I've done a lot of changing in the last 11 years spiritually. But I was able to
Sure.
recount a lot. So I think the story of God really it struggles because I think any thinking person, when you're dealing with someone with some kind of like something in life that seems unfair, honestly, anything. It could be, in my case, it was my brother was a quadriplegic and lived in a home and had really not anything like the quality of life I had. And that empathy that I had is like how could God let this happen? Like why?
Mm.
Like anybody who doesn't ask the question why, I kind of worry. Like, why aren't you asking the question why? And in a way, I feel like that's where my journey began. Like, why is Kevin like this, mommy, daddy? And the answer I got as a young child was, well, God didn't do this. God created the world, but he let it spin and he just kind of he's hands off. And and I that satisfied me for a while. And I think if you're a theologian, you would say that's more of a deistic view.
Uh-huh.
I learned
Uh-huh.
that later, but as a
Yeah.
little girl, you don't have a language for this. But it didn't satisfy for long because as I grew up and I was raised as in a Christian family, as I grew up and was asking, I always was a question asker. If you read the book, you'll see that. But
Right.
I always wondered, well, wait, if God didn't, if He made the world and He doesn't intervene in the affairs of man, as an adult might say, then how is he good? Like, how can he be good? Why wouldn't he? If he can, why wouldn't he? It's like, well, if he's a good God, then why wouldn't he intervene? And there, all those questions that he's either telling the truth, he's telling a lie, or he's crazy, in terms of like, well, who is this God real or not? And the claims that supposedly are made in the Bible, it's like you have to wrestle with that. So I
Mm.
think that I ended up realizing that wait, if I'm going to believe in God, then I need him to answer me for why my brother is the way he is. And so I kind of put God on trial. And so part of my journey is going through those hard questions. And in the church, growing up in a church, a lot of times that's not really invited to ask those hard questions. A lot of times church just says, well, just trust God, or God's in control, or well, just have greater faith, or well, there's a reason for this. And it's kind of like they don't want to be bothered. And so I never really fit in a typical Sunday school class. And so as I continued to grow older, I still loved the Christian faith for being a good person and having those principles. And I still feel like it made sense. But then at some point in my life as a young adult, I went off to work, brand new married, and I just was slammed by people that challenged my faith, and like I didn't have an answer. And I realized it was time I needed to deal with these hard questions. So I went through a lot of different stages in my faith. And then when I finally got a lot of great intellectual answers, I kind of became almost like a legalist, like, well, of course there's a reason. And I thought I could academically explain everything away, but I didn't deal with my heart. And so at some point, it's the book, journeys on. I wrestled to that degree and eventually came to get a greater soul satisfaction, not just a brain satisfaction, and an
Yeah. Yeah.
experience with God that was different. But it was a long time. In fact, I was still doing it when I was writing the book. So I
Hmm.
had to
I'm
revise it a lot.
I loved that about the book. I mean, you said, I've never been one to be satisfied with shallow answers.
Yeah.
And I loved that there was room for any question to be asked.
Mm.
as I was reading that. And you asked the hard questions, you know,
Yeah.
of God,
Good.
um, and you invite the reader to ask those questions too.
Absolutely. Because I've learned it doesn't matter what I've learned. I can tell you all day long. In fact, at one point, I found myself kind of preaching in the book. I was like telling, I'm like, can't do that
Yeah.
because that wouldn't have worked with me. I needed
No,
to learn it
no.
myself. And I know every person has to learn it themselves. You can't inherit someone's faith, which is chapter one. And
Yeah.
you have to go on the journey yourself. And I think so many people in this life, they just accept either what they're born with or what they've always heard or what their pastor said. And their faith might be real, but if they've never challenged it or they've never asked the hard questions, I'm not sure if the depth of the faith is going to satisfy you as richly as if you go through the challenge and if you go through the hard stuff and you're not afraid to ask God or get mad at God and ask Him and wrestle with Him. I don't know if that makes, I mean, I think it makes sense to you, hopefully, because you're reading it, but I'm not encouraging them. If you have a sweet faith and you just accept everything, it's like, God bless you. I just wasn't that person. So I
Yeah.
think in a way I was writing to people more like me that like if you're struggling, it's okay. It's okay because as long as you press through, I believe you'll arrive at a soul satisfying answer with God. Maybe not everything, but some things I think that will start satisfying you in a deep level. It's the people who are afraid to ask the hard questions because they're afraid it might wreck their faith. Sometimes I feel badly for them because I feel like there's so much more richness when you're able to face it head on. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah. It
that
does.
worked.
It does to me. There were a couple things that really struck me in the book. One of the things was when you were in college in a sociology class and you had to identify a project that you were going to
Yeah.
do. That was very revealing. Why don't you share some of that?
Yeah, just I'll summarize, but basically we had to come up with something as a sociology major to do that would challenge what other people around us, their reactions, kind of like the reactions of people. And he gave an example. You can go in an elevator and stand backwards and see what they say and make a research project of that, and I'm like, okay, I don't want to do anything typical. I want to do something unique. And I thought about a long time and then I realized I want to know what it's like to live like my brother. And so basically, my parents arranged to help me with the director of this day program that my brother went to see if there's a day that we can leave Kevin at home because he would know me and I would, it'd be too hard to pretend if he was there. And then I could come in as a newly disabled person who was in a car accident, got some form of cerebral palsy, and I was nonverbal. And so we tricked all the people in the day program except for the director, and I came in and I had to be my brother. And I remember I always wanted to be an actress. I never really was, but I basically acted for most of the day. And the book tells more descriptive, but basically, I mean, I can't really probably imitate it, but I took on my brother's spasticity, which is like he's very stiff and like can't move his arms very well. And I just let my facial, so I just really became him. And it was hard. It was so hard. But one of the scenes I write about in the book is just that I hate tomatoes. Like I always hate tomatoes. And of course, that day they were feeding me stewed tomatoes, which is even worse than tomatoes. And
Which,
so I talk about
yeah, for people that are watching this, you really got into this part. I mean,
yeah.
Kevin has to be fed. So they thought that you had cerebral palsy, and so they fed you with a
They
spoon,
spoon
right?
fed me. Yeah, because I can't
Yeah.
use my hands. So, and I wish somebody had videoed, like that was the day. I was a long time ago, so we didn't video it. We don't have iPhones or whatever. But yeah, like so one of the things that my brother does when he eats, and he's been on a G tube since then, and now it's that story is back and forth. And but at that time he wasn't. And so they would just shove in food and they would hold his mouth closed and they would have him chew it and they would force it. And that was it seems harsh now, but at the time, it's just kind of what they did. And he actually ate well and everything. So I just remember them opening. Like, so when he doesn't want something, even to this day, he'll close his mouth. And so I'm thinking, like, what do? I can't eat tomatoes. So I just close my mouth and I did this, and lo and behold, they literally opened my mouth, shoved it in, and I'm like dying. And then I'm thinking to myself, okay, what does Kevin do? What does Kevin do when he doesn't want something? So I spit it all out. um, and they did what they do to Kevin, is they grabbed it all up, all my regurgitated tomatoes, and shoved it back in my mouth. And I wanted to die. And in fact, I almost broke character. I'm like, we're done. Like, I can't do this anymore. But I persevered through, and I got to the end of the day. And that was, to this day, one of the craziest stories ever. So
And
glad you enjoyed it.
at the end of the day, you revealed to the
Yeah.
staff who you were, right?
Yeah, I remember I was laying on the ground. They like left me there forever. I'm like laying there around, like doing this or whatever. And then the director came over. Okay, time, Camille, and they had called me Camille, my real name. They're like, would you like to would you like to say anything? And I stood up and I said, sorry, this is a project for college. And the people were shocked. And I was like, yay, surprise.
Did
So
anybody get mad?
I don't remember. I honestly wish I remembered. I
Mhm.
don't think they got mad, but I remember thinking like they were very shocked, like, oh my gosh, whoa. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, you were mean to me. Like, but I wish I remembered more. I do. It doesn't, some of the parts I totally remember, and others, it's like, oh, wish I had journaled or recorded or something. But
One of the things that you said in the book was that you realized how difficult it must be for Kevin to be so confined in his body
yeah,
24/7, um, and never be able to get away from his disability. There was never any, ability for him to experience anything except really being confined, and that you found that hard as you were doing that day, that it was boring, it was so intensely boring, you couldn't speak, you couldn't itch
yeah,
something that itched, you couldn't scratch, you couldn't
yeah,
move, really confining, so that was just really, really interesting.
yeah. It's
Um,
still that still bothers me to this day
yeah,
constantly. And I think the, the title of the book is Hope for Secondhand Suffering: Tools for the Heart When You Can't Fix Your Loved One's Pain. Well, I'll show you real quick.
yes, yes.
And one of the things that I really found interesting about the story writing is the concept of secondhand suffering. And what you just described, like when I'm fine, like I'm free, I can eat, I can do whatever. But I'm constantly thinking about my brother not being fine, or being confined, or being in a place where he's bored, or he can't scratch an itch. Or, there's one time I think I even tell somewhere in the book, like I visited him and an ant was crawling up into his mouth, and like thank God I
Mhm.
was there, but I was able to get the way that, but he couldn't have done that. And so I constantly am preoccupied with the things that my brother must be feeling, which is kind of that empathy, we would call it empathy, but that for me has resulted in what I've labeled and trademarked, actually, something called secondhand suffering, where you suffer because your loved one suffers. And
Mhm.
nobody had ever given language to that exact feeling before. I mean, there's things like vicarious grief, and there's other therapy type terms, but in terms of something just lay for a lay person, like secondhand smoke, secondhand suffering, it's like others are affected by the smoke, or others, it's not just the smoker that ingests, it's like everybody around them kind of breathes it too. Well, the same thing with suffering, but you just can't see it. It's a little bit more invisible. And so I've always felt invisible with my suffering for my brother. And I think any mother would understand this. This is not like, it's not rocket science. It's not just about disabilities, but any pain that we feel that we can't fix when someone we love is holding. It's like, how do you deal with that? And that's kind of, I guess, a second answer to the book. Like, why did I write that? It was
Mhm.
coming to grips with what that feeling was, and that feeling like, yeah, my brother must be bored, or he's confined, or he's in a wheelchair. And especially during, the COVID days, when like literally they're just stuck there and they can't even see family. It was horrible. And just, I think some people might feel that deeper than others, but for me, and speaking for those of us who do, or allow ourselves to feel that pain, it's dang hard, you know?
Yeah, yeah. When you meet other people just in the course of your daily life who are secondhand sufferers, who are they?
Yeah.
What are their circumstances
I'm
like?
meeting them more and more now that the
I
language is
bet.
there. I mean, it's one of my, well, I won't name who it is, but a new friend. She has a son that has bipolar, who's in his mid-20s, and a mom who's got cognitive dementia. And she's right in the middle, and she's got other kids that are quote unquote, normal or typical or whatever. And she has to struggle. Like, how does she take a vacation with her husband? How does she like she's dealing, she feels both of their pains and she can't fix it. And she's tried to fix it and it doesn't work. So she's suffering. I have another gosh, I have several friends right now whose kids in their mid 20s or early 30s have end stage cancer. How do you
Wow.
deal with that? As a
Yeah.
parent, like
Yeah.
that's not supposed to happen. Um, Praying that that doesn't end, but one did. Unfortunately, 25-year-old, just recently.
Mhm.
That mother is, how do you describe that?
Mhm.
Obviously right now disabilities are just really sadly kind of increasing, especially in autism. It's like you
Right.
have a child that's totally fine at age 2.5, and then age 3, something changes and they're not the same anymore. And like you have a whole new life. How do you deal with that? You can't, it's like you're in it 24/7, and that's the one thing with my
Yeah.
brother is I wasn't always there. I'm just a visitor when I come. I'm just I have a normal life. So like the people who are actually caregiving constantly for someone who's got chronic illness, these are the people that are really relating to the topic of secondhand suffering.
Hmm. What would you say is your message of hope for people that are in these circumstances where there's just no easy answers, and maybe it's something they're going to have to live with
Yeah.
the rest of their life?
And that's kind of the people I'm mostly talking to, although it's for anybody.
Right.
I would say, that's I talk about several tools, it's dealing with those little things one by one by one by one by one that don't solve the big problem maybe, but they solve maybe smaller problems. So things like dealing with your own feelings of guilt, for it. A lot of times I was feeling like, well, gosh, why me and or why him and not me, and so
Mhm.
doing the emotional stuff, get rid of toxic thoughts, get rid of like take care of your own heart, your own soul, your own mind, your own body. How do you take care of yourself? Because so many caregivers end up just focusing the other, and it's just not sustainable. You have to get help. I think needing community. I think gosh, there's so many things. Feeling, I think spiritually, pursuing spiritual hope. I think sometimes we can go so far with the world's answers, but then we hit a wall. How do we get past that wall? Well, often to me, that's where God comes in. And a true faith, not just a religious faith that you check a box, oh, I went to church. No, a true faith that feeds your heart, your soul, your mind, your spirit. I feel like ultimately that's where you can find hope in the intersection of suffering um and hope or joy. I feel like finding that ability to sit in that mix is one of the greatest blessings I've had. And finding that you can fix some things. There are things like there's little miracles that takes place. Maybe it's not the
Mhm.
full thing. I love Nick Vujicic's quote. I say at the end that we may not get a miracle for our loved one, but we can be a miracle for someone. And how do we do that? Well, we first have to take care of ourselves, because if we don't, we can't be of help. But what
Right.
can we do? So there's many things that I've been able to do for my brother that he'd probably still be suffering worse right now if I hadn't stepped in. So I think finding like redefining what a victory is, I think
Oh,
is part of it.
interesting. That's interesting. We just have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask you, do you have any idea what Kevin's perception of God is?
Wow. I love that question. And if we had more than a minute, I would pause longer. But um, I will say I don't, to be honest. But
Uh-huh.
I hope I believe that I have enough evidence from him that I believe he can and does speak with angels.
Oh, how
I
interesting.
believe that. And I have a specific example I'll share at the end of the book. I won't say because you'll have to read it, but because I know you're in process right now. But I think that God has a special place in his heart for people like Kevin. And I do believe that um, even though he hasn't fixed the whole thing, and I don't quite know why still, I do know that I believe he's going to speak to his spirit. And I've seen times when Kevin's just smiling in the distance, and I've heard some, well, I'll let that say, I'm gonna say that for the book, but
Okay.
I believe he may be having conversations with angels. That's just my belief. So
That is amazing. That is amazing. Well, I'm not quite done with the book yet, but I'm going to be finishing it in the next few days. So I can't wait. I can't wait to read that part.
thank you. The books, I mean, I hope you'll tell me. I hope it's a great read, but I don't think it's a fast read. I think I'm dealing with, some bigger issues and things, but I
Yeah.
think hopefully it's readable and people can get something out of it.
And I should say, as I'm reading this, I'm feeling like this is something that a middle schooler would find really interesting.
Wow.
I feel like it's such an interesting story, and it taps into emotions a lot. It taps into doubts and questions all the way through, which kids are asking these days. And
Yeah.
so, more than ever, I think much more than my generation did, and
Yeah.
probably your generation too. Um,
Completely. Yeah.
they're asking really serious questions early on. So I feel like this book would be something that even a middle schooler would find
Agreed.
really interesting.
Yeah, I wish I had had it in middle school when I was asking all my questions
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, me too, me too. Well, Camille, thank you so much for taking the time for this conversation. And people can find your book where?
Well, it's on Amazon, but it's also, anywhere books are sold, globally, actually. So my website is camilleblock.cc. And my Instagram and Facebook are the only two places I'm posting, but I have a lot of information on there. Are just at camilleblock.author. But yeah, it's available for pre-order before August 17th, and after August 17th, it should be available anywhere you want. And you get it whenever you order it.
Okay, and I will include the information in the show notes and a link to your book and the social media info so that people can
Great.
follow you. I'm
Thank
so
you.
excited about this book. I think it's going to mean a lot to people.
Well, Cheryl, you've been an incredible support, and it's so nice to reconnect with you on this purpose. And thank you for everything you've done. And I'm so grateful to have this time with you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Thank you, Cheryl.